Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Jeff Rock, and welcome to another D. Hilton Associates webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about credit union board governance practices and the trends therein. So before we get into that, let's dig into a little bit of an administrative process. We will be recording this webinar, so if you missed something, please feel free to go to our website at dhilton.com. You can also find all the previous webinars there as well. Following this webinar, you'll also receive an automated follow-up email, which will have a link in there so you can download the slide deck that we've utilized. Also in that follow-up email, there'll be a quick survey. Take a couple moments, fill that out for us. Let us know how we're doing. It gives us good insight of what's working, what's not working, and what topics you'd actually like to see in the future. If you have any questions through this is probably going to be a very dense webinar. We're going to try to keep it to 45 minutes, 50 minutes, but we're probably going to end up knocking up against that door. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those questions through the presentation. We'll hopefully be able to catch them on the fly and be able to answer your questions. So I've brought in the experts today. Joining me in the studio is John Andrews. How are you, John?
It's great to be back, Jeff.
Yeah, it has been a hot minute, hasn't it?
It has been. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. And also joining us again, Hillary Miley. Hello, Hillary. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, without further ado, I'll hand it over to John.
Thank you, Jeff. Hey, let me ask you a real question before we get started.
Sure.
You fancy yourself a car guy, right?
Absolutely.
What's your favorite car from the 60s?
From the 60s? That's a great question. I don't know. I guess a Charger, maybe?
So an American.
Yeah.
Muscle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then you get to answer the next question.
Oh, no.
Okay, no. So I
didn't study for this test.
So in the 60s, who would have won the battle, GM or Toyota?
In the 60s? I'd say Toyota would be the start of it all.
You weren't even born in the 60s. Our public education system has let us
Has failed us here. No, it's American muscle here, of course.
GM was the biggest, baddest corporation on the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And they just pumped out the cars from Detroit, and they were just huge. And they just dominated the world market. So there was a world event that changed the course of that battle. You remember what you were born then? It was in the 70s. What happened in the 70s? Hillary, you can chime in too.
The gas crisis.
The oil embargo and the gas crisis. So all of a sudden, when we were going bigger, boat size cars, gas mileage be damned. It started to be about efficiency, gas mileage, and those types of things. And also, you thought about the mentality of the car business back then. Ford said you can have any color as long as it's
black,
because, we don't care what the consumer wants. We're just going to keep building these cars and keep cashing the checks. But in the 70s, that changed the consumer's look. But a lot of the car makers forgot to ask what the consumer wanted. And all of a sudden, Toyota said, look, we're this chain of islands. We have this many people. If we go to North America, we'll have this many people. We can sell a lot more cars. So they actually sent their engineers to California, and they started taking pictures of ladies' backsides in supermarket parking lots.
That makes sense. That would certainly fly in this day and age too.
And they got arrested.
Yes.
But what they were doing research, and the cops said, "Oh yeah, sure, you're doing research." But what they were doing is, when they saw the mom with 3 kids trying to load the groceries from the car to the, from the store to the car, and then they have to go over that big trunk. And just things going everywhere. They said, we need to look at minivans. We looked at lower decks. Mm-hmm. And they started making all these features that were very appealing. And then you added that with the gas crisis. And guess what happened? They overtook, Camry is always one of the best-selling cars for years and years because they were willing to adapt their model. Mm-hmm. While as the Americans said, you'll buy what we give you and you'll like it. So the point of the story is GM wasn't good at listening back then, mm-hmm. and they lost their market share and they lost their dominance. So when we look at moving that to the boardroom, sometimes we do that too. Sometimes we're too busy saying this is what you need instead of listening to what you want, because there's a lot of homogeneity on the boards coming from the same backgrounds and same business and same socioeconomic classes, and all of a sudden we're missing the boat some cases. So as we talk the talk of wanting to look at diversity on boards, are we really walking the walk? So we have this comment that says, too often we conclude that we've lost our edge because of external factors. the economy's bad, the competition is too tough, the regulators are killing us. But the true fact is we didn't stretch. We didn't push. We were happy with incremental gains year over year and not looking at the bigger picture of who are we leaving out. And I always contend that a lot of times credit unions will just get the cream of the crop, and that's good for year over year growth. And all of a sudden, somebody else will find, a niche that we haven't done, and that becomes very profitable. So we choose to fit, not stretch. And the three big examples are, if you see this in a boardroom happening, the first is rationalization. Well, they're working so hard, they're doing their best, there's nothing we can do. Well, if you're a member and representing the members, that's not the best thing you want to hear. And sometimes we work on procedural problems and not strategic problems. And the best story I ever heard was that it was a military base, and somebody had cashed a $200 bad check. And so they spent 3 hours at the board meeting talking about how are we going to fix this procedure so nobody does this to us again. And so they put this in on a Monday, and the first person literally that was going to cash a check was the general that ran the place. And he kind of points to his arm and his name tag. Yeah, I'm kind of a big deal around here. And ultimately that soured the relationship just because of that one event. So when we're not looking strategic or what the members need, that can be an issue or problem. And then the classic is, we want to be $5 billion in 5 years, or we're going to be $1 billion in 2 years. And what is the context of that? How many people are we going to help along the way is a much more important way to look at that. So when we looked at 0809, one of the 5 financial crises that we've dealt with in D. Hilton's history, it was interesting to look at what banks did in 08 and 09. And that's when they really got caught, selling bad things to the wrong people, selling too much to the right people, overcharging and those things. So they went on this cultural cleanse, so to speak, and they reevaluated things, and they spent millions of dollars, and I'm talking from Wall Street down to the community bank level, to look at about how we can get more ethics in our handbooks, because obviously it was the employee's fault that we weren't doing this. But you know what? After 08, 09, things got back to normal, and then we come back to the same exact problems. Not serving community, not committed to diversity, and only going after cherry-picking markets that they want. And it was basically window dressing. So as you go into strategic planning this fall and we look at diversity and we look at about how we expand boards, the idea is start with asking your constituents and your stakeholders, what do they want? Okay. So we look at the agenda today, just kind of setting the stage for, we've got some really good stats today on what we're doing with compensation and board dynamics and demographics, but also we want to look at these concepts of advisory, associate, and emeritus, and then we'll finish up with what we think about self-assessments, team assessments, and those types of things. So at this point, I'm going to introduce the star of Miss Margaret's second grade tap class. She took 4 lessons, and she can do the buffalo. So if we have time at the end of the podcast, I definitely want to see the buffalo.
No Q&A this time. It'll be a dance off.
I think that skill has now left me.
Well, it's a shame. Your dad paid a boatload of money for that. Anyway, Hillary, take it off first.
All right. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about what board of directors at credit unions look like today. We do a biennial board survey every other year. And last year would have been normally when we do it, but obviously it was postponed because of the pandemic. We felt like there were other research initiatives that we wanted to focus on. So we recently did part 1 of our board survey, and that particularly focused on board demographics today, as well as what board compensation programs look like, and then how boards are looking towards the future. So first, let's talk about what boards look like from a number perspective. So you can see that we've seen a little bit of a downward trend of credit unions having smaller boards. So compared to, say, 2014, we're much more likely to have boards that are 7 members than we are 9. And that represents about 40% of credit unions of all asset sizes. And then 40% also have 9 board members. So you can see that credit unions are focusing a little bit on, how to keep things streamlined. One of the challenges of boards is, if you have so many members, it makes it difficult to come to decisions and really get things moving and, stay on your agenda and that sort of thing. So that's one of the main challenges of having a large board.
So when I look at this, I go back to 14. As we've grown as an industry and consolidated through mergers, and the sole sponsor credit unions just aren't as prevalent as they once were. When you had 5 to 7 people, they could run a shop or show that size, and it was a good cohesive group, and they got things done. But mergers meant, well, maybe we need to take 2 board members, from the credit union coming into us, or we're going to new communities, so we need better representation. So a lot of the industry factors have caused this number. And I've only had one CEO tell me this, and I thought it was very insightful. He says 15, 13, bring it on. Bigger the board, the better. Because I want that. I want the feedback. I want to hear what's going out there. I want diversity. We've got spots, and it's my job to work and interact with. They're my boss, and so bring it on. Not the most popular opinion out there, but it's not something that I think we're going to see bigger boards, not smaller boards.
Mm-hmm. So this is the number of board members by asset group. And you can see kind of like what John was talking about is that larger credit unions are more likely to have larger boards. There's a very clear movement of that blue 7 members that switches over to 9 as we get larger in size. So among those $1 billion credit unions, 55% of 9 board members compared to only 30% among boards in the 100 to 250 million group. As a credit union gets bigger, I think kind of like what John is saying, there's merger factors that come into play. There's more, complex organizational needs that probably, those boards are looking for different experience factors that you're going to need to have a slightly larger board in order to really make use of that. So I found this question to be particularly interesting. So over time, when we ask boards to self-report, they're much less likely to say that overall engagement is extremely high compared to previous years, while more say that engagement is neutral. I think there's probably a lot of factors that contribute to this. It could be a result of, as credit unions do become more complex, it's important that boards are invested, and as more time and commitment is required of boards, is it more challenging for them to really stay engaged? There probably is also an element of the last year. There's a little bit of fatigue among most people, and that could be resulted in showing up in the results of the survey. But overall, this is a little bit concerning that, hopefully we're not moving towards a culture of apathy in our boards of directors.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking is some of this is regulatory induced. Mm-hmm. I mean, you think about the requirements needed 20 years ago to be a board member, continuing ed, how you were held accountable, and just the scope of operations. And it's a daunting task today, to keep up. And so you can't necessarily rely on the experience of the past, because it is a different show. And, there are, consequences if you don't. So I think that's some fatigue. And obviously last year, people met, well, even though it was virtually, a heck of a lot more times, a month to kind of figure out what to do and what the direction was. So we're seeing a little of this, but would your prediction be in 3 years it's going to go back to, 18 levels, or do you think it's going to continue?
That's a good question. I mean, I definitely think there probably is a good influence of just recent situations that is contributing to this. I mean, hopefully we would move back towards that 2018 and 2016 number where we're looking at about 10% that are neutral. I think it's important for, a good number of boards to feel like they are engaged. And obviously, this is a board chair reporting on behalf of the rest of the members, but regardless, it's definitely an interesting trend.
And I hope as the trend towards diversity, and we bring different demographic categories into the board, it brings enthusiasm.
Yep.
The new blood, new fresh look at things. Mm-hmm. When I do strategic planning, one of the first things I say as we leave the door, I said, you raise your hand if you've been here more than 10 years. And then usually 7 out of 9 people raise their hands, and I go, your job is never to let us forget what makes this place special. You are the ones that need to tell the stories, the narrative of where we started with the cigar box, and we chipped our money in, and we built this place, and we've helped this town or community through all these ups and downs through the years. And then I say, people have been here less than 10 years, raise your hand. And then 1 or 2. And I go, your job is to always, it doesn't make sense at all of why we do it this way. Always questioning. And I think it's not friction, but it's that challenging, makes a great dynamic. Defend what we do. Don't forget what we do great. And then make sure that we're serving everybody. Mm-hmm. That's a great formula.
Yep.
And now the board that has 2 people that have been there more than 20 years and then 7 that have been there less than 10 or whatever, there's some challenges there. The culture is at risk. So we have to be careful with that.
Okay, so one more demographic stat. So we asked board members, what the prevalent education level was. Pretty consistently over recent years, we've seen that a bachelor's degree is usually the majority of education attainment for board members. 60% say that that's the education, and then another 20% have master's degrees. And this kind of plays into the next slide where
I was going to say
I'm sorry.
Too many lawyers.
Was there one?
No, 2.8%.
2.8. Oh, okay.
That's way too many.
One was too many.
I mean, that includes MDs too.
If there's any attorneys out there, I apologize.
His email is john at
All right. So next, professional background. So, as boards change, as credit unions change, they move from potentially, a single sponsor credit union to a community sponsor. Communities change. Obviously, we've seen a lot of, especially in large metro areas, the demographic makeup of those areas has changed a lot. So what is a credit union doing to make sure that their board has, diverse experience, can bring different perspectives to the table? And what does a board need to really look at to improve with their own credit union? Obviously, some credit unions, they have a gap in a certain knowledge. And so that's what they're looking for to fill in their next board member. So this is kind of what we're looking for when we ask this question is, what is that professional background that's valued at your board? Where are you trying to move and improve in? 45% right now have a finance or accounting background, which obviously, is very positive. And that's something that we've seen consistently over time.
That hasn't wavered over the years. It's
not
always
at all.
been the number one background, and it hasn't really wavered less.
Yeah.
These other bars kind of move and shake over the years, but that one's been consistently at the top.
Yeah.
So okay.
So do you feel the board accurately represents the demographics of your credit union membership? So I think that this plays a little bit into those previous slides is, does the board really capture what the credit union is? Do we have accurate representation of the membership? And, just over half feel like they do, but 40% are very open in saying that they don't think that they represent their membership well from a demographic standpoint.
And that's kind of the first step to being successful in this journey is to admit that, I don't have all the information and the demographics don't match up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that we'll tackle a little bit later here. So I spent a lot of time looking at not-for-profits outside of the credit union industry because I have a passion for governance, but I also love the idea of governance in the for-profit world. And you've seen in the last 2 to 5 years, this idea of ESG, environmental, social, and governance being part of the board's agenda now, and now DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, coming on board as well, and having to see this in annual reports and materials that go out to stockholders. So this is something that we're seeing real prevalent in the proxy statements in the last 2 years. So look at this list. Now, this is a for-profit company. We're not saying that you're going to match up with this, but I'm thinking, why not look at your board and your governance practices in this setting? And I think there's some value there. Look at the list there. The boys club interlocking, my buddy's on the board, I'm on his board. The president is, president or general manager, as we used to call them at a credit union, are on the board. All that's going away. the idea that that we're seeing clawbacks, and we do a lot of that in our exec comp work now, is if there's any shenanigans, we're going after it because, it's not right for the membership to have to deal with that. So when you look at that list, you could come up with your own list of why you're independent and serving the membership. And then they also do this kind of infographic, which I think is really cool. They say, of our board, let me give you a composite look of what we stand for. 8 out of the 9 are independent. A third are females. Could that be better? Absolutely. But again, they're stating, like, here we are today, and will we strive to do better? Absolutely. How long people have been on the board? 6 years versus, you could see some credit union boards where it might be 20 plus years. Not good or bad, but it just shows you that we've got the past, we've got the present, and then the idea is like, how long have you been on the board? And then it gets to competencies, governance competency. So again, this is from a kind of a fintech, I would say. And look what they have on their board. So they say, what percentage of these competencies are represented on our board? So finance, yes. Payments, yes. Lending, yes. Strategy, legal, regulatory. So think of, you're looking at your board, where your strengths and weaknesses are. And when I mean weaknesses, what could we add to our board to make us well-rounded and serving the membership in the best way possible? It's going to start to stick out a little bit. So we do have surveys. If you're interested in doing that, we have it's a pretty quick exercise to kind of to map out where you are today.
And just looking at this on a regular basis, you can't measure something, or you can't improve something if you're not measuring it.
Absolutely.
So you got to just keep track of what's happening.
Absolutely. Jeff, what's the cleanest public restroom to go into?
Buc-ee's.
Well, you had that answer right.
I'm on top of this one. I'm ready.
But when I do training of frontline employees, I always say the one where I have to write on the back of the door, John Andrews cleaned the bathroom at 10 o'clock, because if something happened in there, John's
responsible here.
John should have been in there and take care of that. But yes, if you haven't been to Texas, we recommend Buc-ee's. You can go to NASA. You can go to see the Cowboys play in Dallas. Go to Austin city limits, but we recommend a Buc-ee's anytime you can.
I mean, they have full billboards of just how clean their bathrooms are. So you can't ask from someone from Texas that question.
And they deliver.
And they deliver. So that's what they do. So we're going to transition now into a question that's been emerging last 3 or 4 years. As does it sound counterintuitive 10 years ago? Yeah, like volunteers get paid. And then as we look at the marketplace, as businesses, our credit unions get more complex, yeah, we need to look at getting those skill sets in place and remunerating them for their service. So we always get this question is, well, what's the parameters? So one thing we didn't mention up front, how big was this survey? Like this source here, sample size was
like 4,000.
Yeah. So obviously not all state charter credit unions, federal credit unions, but we went out to a boatload of credit unions to get this. So this is like data's plus or minus 3%. So it's solid. So let's get into this next category, which is, what are the comp practices?
Okay. So obviously the first thing we want to start with is, are you even allowed to offer board compensation? Because as we know, not all states, the majority of states do not allow, state regulators do not allow boards to offer compensation outside of things like expense reimbursement. So 43% said yes, they are allowed to offer compensation. So the following slides are of that group. So obviously those credit unions who can offer compensation are the ones that we're focusing on.
Yeah, so we just wanted to disclose step one is, if your state doesn't allow it, then none of this data is going to work for you because you can't get past that first hurdle.
Right. And we're not talking about expense reimbursement. We're talking about formal compensation programs. Okay. Yep. So do board members receive the following insurance policies? Obviously the biggest ones, 40% have E&O, and then we've got D&O liability, but 24%, almost a quarter, don't offer their board members any insurance policies. And this is something that we do get asked a lot about is, obviously, what do those perks look like for credit union boards? Is this something for those who can't offer compensation? Can they offer health insurance, long-term care insurance, disability, and that sort of thing? So you can see, since we started doing the board survey in 2014, there has been a steady increase in credit unions that say they compensate their board. So we had 12% in 2014, and now we're at 22%. So you can see it's very clearly moving in that upward trend in which credit unions are feeling like they need to put a program in place, really have a formal policy for how they're going to ensure that they have that experience and, those different skill sets on their board. So we ask boards, how do they structure their compensation? 37% have it set up like a meeting fee. A quarter offer a monthly stipend, and then we've got another 13% yearly stipend quarterly, and then only 7% offer it as an hourly rate. And so when we go to the next few slides and we're talking about the total compensation, that's all annualized compensation. So we wanted to make sure that we're comparing those numbers really apples to apples.
I always thought it was interesting about hourly rates is we could be encouraging people to do 8-hour board meetings or instead of a nice clean 2-hour board meeting. So from optics, I always like the idea of the flat fee that you see in some of these other categories. And again, I haven't done a ton of research to say what compelled people to use that as the as the driver for the decision. And I'm sure there's a good reason why they did that. But I always thought from an optics, as we're going to a regulator to get the final approval, the flat fees made a lot more, stronger narrative, I should say.
Right. And it's a very clear-cut way to do the program rather than hourly where you could be incentivizing for negative things.
Yeah.
Okay, so next we've got the actual compensation findings. So we split it up in credit unions that are 100 million plus, and then we also looked at credit unions that were $1 billion plus, because there is variance in how they structure their programs and what they're offering for compensation, but not a lot. You can see that. So for 100 million plus credit unions, the 50th percentile, the median is for the chair is 24,000. And then the vice chair is 17,000. But you can see, how for those credit unions that do offer varying compensation across the different positions, there is difference based on those responsibilities of the position, obviously with the chair and the vice chair being some of the higher ones, and then secretary as well, just because of that time commitment that's required of those positions.
So what I found interesting about this is, we ran a ton of statistics on this to look at, is there a true, regression line that says the bigger you are, the more you pay your directors, and it just washes out. It's not there. And when we look at under $1 billion, over $1 billion, it's not there. And we looked at the $1 billion group, we saw the 75th percentiles move up, but the ranges were pretty tight around, their bell curve was a little wider, not as steep, but still that's, what I thought is we're paying for the job, we're paying for the strategic contribution, but we're not necessarily based on size.
Right. Yeah. There's not that much relationship between size and what they're paying the board.
Yeah. So if you're out there, again, just a quick lesson on percentiles. Let's say you wanted to pay your board $47,000. That's not meaning you're not a standard deviation away from the norm here. You're going to be within the groups. You pay $150,000, then you're going to have some type of discussion or backing that, the why. It could be scope of operation, contribution, or whatever. But again, this is a guideline, not an absolute. And think about it, every day this could change. As more credit unions come online with compensation packages, these numbers are going to move and wiggle a little bit. So I always encourage people, whether it's exact comp or volunteer comp, guideline, not a laser number we're trying to hit.
Yep. So we also asked, in addition to standard board members, are there other members who are eligible for compensation? And 21% of those who do compensate, their supervisory committee members also receive compensation. 7% offer it to associate advisory members, and then only 1% to emeritus members. So when did you put your compensation program in place? So a little over half said they put it in place 5 years ago. And then we do have 24% who've done it really recently in the last 2 years. And then overall, 18% said they did use a third party to develop the compensation program. And that's where, that peer information comes from. How are we making sure that we can clearly demonstrate how our program is built, what it is based upon, and that we have that data to back up what we're putting in place for our board members.
We had a question.
Oh, okay.
The difference between a stipend and a monthly fee, a monthly board fee versus the monthly stipend. How do you categorize that?
So the way we did that is,
Did I say that right, Jeff?
Well,
Okay.
There's a meeting fee and a monthly stipend.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the monthly is just strictly that they're being paid for just the amount for 12 months.
So if we don't have a pre-board meeting or exec
Right,
meeting,
doesn't matter.
It just,
Yep.
no matter.
Yeah, regardless of how many times that they meet, how much time they meet. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yep. So we wanted to also find out, does the board feel like this compensation structure is competitive? A little less than half said yes, and then 30% said they're not sure. And I did find that interesting that, if we're going to build compensation programs, you want to make sure that you feel confident in what you're putting in place. But I think a lot of that is also that this information tends to be kind of hard to nail down for a lot of the industry. And that's why we do these kinds of surveys so that we can collect that data, because, it takes quite a bit of research to find what other boards are paying and make sure that you have that data to support your program. So I wasn't surprised that only 30% said they're not sure. But it definitely indicates that a little more transparency could be valuable for the industry.
Well, I look at this sometimes how we look at compensation for employees.
Right.
Somebody knows a guy that makes a boatload more than we're paying. So there's always these anecdotal stories. And if you go online, maybe you find something, but you don't know the context of why they paid the number. So that's the value of this type of research is we're trying to define the question, answer the question the same way so we can have reliable results. But I think when people think they're not sure, it's just they don't, you got to do a reality check.
Right.
We do exact comp. We say you need to go to the market every year, every 2 years to see what's, are you still competitive? You were competitive 2 years ago. If you look at a 990, you're absolutely comparing yourself to 2 years ago.
Right.
And what do you need to do today? So, anybody has a commitment to look at this every year or every 2 years, I think it's a best practice.
Yeah.
And so we whittle that number down because as more people come online, people change, we can look at the differences that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 22% that say no, is that an education piece or just because they know a guy who knows a guy, or they didn't, when it was time to vote that their position didn't win. We just don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for those who don't have a compensation plan for their board members, they don't offer compensation. So we did see a little bit of a decrease in those who say that they're not going to implement a compensation plan. So it went down by about 10% compared to 2018, the last time we did the survey. A little over 10% said they're not eligible. 12% say they do not know. But you can see that general perception of whether or not that this makes sense for your credit union is shifting. We have a greater percentage that do plan to do it within the next 2 years. And obviously, it's not just the desire to put this in place, but there's also, of course, regulatory factors in consideration. If a credit union, a certain state is evaluating this as something that might be implemented in the next few years, we don't really have a timeline on that. So it kind of puts these kinds of future plans a little bit up in the air, but you can see that there is a little bit of movement and openness to this program.
Okay. We had a question come up that said, is board engagement higher? Is there a correlation between the higher you pay the board, the more engaged they are?
No.
And you'll see that in CEO pay as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The idea is, it has to be in the ballpark. It has to be perceived as fair, but it's not an incremental number that's going to be
right
special. And also, again, if we have the same group of people for 5 and 10 years, it becomes not entitlement, but it's just old hat. They don't think of it
right.
twice.
It's not in the forefront of, they're not going to every board meeting thinking about that factor.
Yeah. And I think is, the analogy in the exact comp world where we do balanced scorecards and variable pay, we're not doing those to encourage, the CEO to work 2 more hours, a day. It's just to recognize that work. And that's how I always try to preach, it's reward and recognition. It's not money.
Mm-hmm.
And so by having this program, the recognition that this is a serious job, we take your contribution seriously. We're appreciative of your contributions. And that's why we want to do this. It kind of spins into this next question that says, do you disclose this when you're recruiting board members? And the information is going to be out there. You're going to have to disclose this, but don't lead with it.
Right.
The idea is that if the heart's in the right place and they want to serve their community or the field of membership, that's the key driver that's going to make them successful, not paying them $21,000 versus $20,000.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Just adding that factor to your board policies is not going to move the needle.
And you've seen that since we've been doing this longitudinal study. That hasn't changed.
Yep.
So we wanted to kind of move in, especially, we do a ton of merger work where we work on the governance issues. Number one deal breaker for a merger is who's going to be chair, who gets how many seats, who's going to be CEO. And the idea is, well, there's only a finite set of work that's out there and of seats. And then how do we pull it off? So the idea that we wanted this idea of associate members to kind of fill the bench, that, and as they progress to the actual board, and then we wanted emeritus to kind of have a soft landing zone for, folks that still want to be contributing, but maybe can't be there every month, or they live in a different part of the community and are, another part of the world, and they're just not going to be available when we need them to be even on Zoom calls. So that's been in place for a long, long time. So the interesting thing and what we really want to focus on today is this idea of what advisory programs can be, because that there's semantic issues there and there's some quality control issues there. But when we look at emeritus, if anybody doesn't have it, we love this idea. And again, when I said raise your hand, if you've been there more than 10 years, these are the people that have great stories of why we're a credit union, when we almost didn't make it, when, the community was really hurting and we stepped up. So we love that. We love them to participate in strategic planning. We love them to participate in continuing education. Here's a definition of what that would be up on the screen now. Just can't vote, on specific issues. Can you influence a board? Absolutely. Can you still be a contributor? 100%. But do you need that seat? Some people do, and I totally respect that. But the ability to kind of transition off is a great legacy that you can leave. And now this idea of associates is where you bring people up and they participate, continuing ed, get their credentials up, and then when a spot comes open, you kind of have that built slate, so to speak. We love those ideas. So, stop thinking of your volunteers as 9 people in a supervisory committee. There's a lot of different ways we can get people involved.
Well, and also for the emeritus is it's not just we need that spot. It's also if a board member has decided that they don't want to have the same kind of time commitment and that there's other things they want to focus on, but their knowledge is extremely valuable, then there are alternatives in which we're still keeping them involved and we can still, really access that experience, but maybe they don't feel the same level of pressure that they did before.
I totally agree. So we moved to this concept. It's not new, but I think it's misused, and it's this idea of an advisory board. So in the generic not-for-profit world, it sometimes becomes the constituents or who we're serving. If it's a food bank, the people that are going to be using the food bank, using them as advisory board to see how we can meet the needs. The number one challenge with advisory boards is this homogenous group of sometimes older individuals are told by someone else what they need. And the classic response is, I know what you want, but here's what you need. And there's a disconnect because that homogenous group hasn't lived through those experiences. I'm from a middle-class family. I never missed a meal. And if I'm going to be on a food bank, I would love to know what it is to go to bed hungry. But then the problem with advisory boards in that sector is then they don't put that person on the board. And how that's a very powerful position is when you look at option A or option B is I want to defer to you. How would that make you feel? Because I'm only, trying to assume and guess and have empathy, yes, but it's not necessarily going to be just dead on the right decision. So I want to give credit to this because this is a great analogy. Her name is Sapna Sapori. She's in the Pacific Northwest. She does a lot with environmental groups. So Sapna Sapori. So listen to this analogy she came up with. It says, imagine it's Friday night. You've had a tough week, so you're going to take your family to a restaurant because you just, nobody wants to cook and the kids are going crazy, so let's go out. So you make a reservation, you show up, and the hostess says, we're so backed up right now, so if you just stand over on the side, we're going to get to you. And then when you look at the dining room, only a third of the people are eating, and 2/3 have finished their meal. They're laughing, having a good time, and you're saying, would you just please leave? my kid's about, give me a steak knife. This kid is driving me crazy. And then all of a sudden, you see a couple come in. They hand the waitress, some money in her hand. All of a sudden, a seat is available. You go, hey, I had a reservation. I see. There's a game here. And then you see some people say, when am I on the list? When am I on the list? And they go, oh, you're next, you're next. So they go across the street to eat because there's no wait. And then they go tell everybody that, this place stinks. They don't honor the reservations. And she says, that's exactly how a board operates. And I go, wow, that was pretty powerful for me. So think about that. She goes, boardrooms have limited capacity, just like a restaurant has limited capacity. It takes time for board members to leave, meaning, forget about term limits, just like I'm going to, we've got this great person that's up and coming that we want to get the diversity on the board, but we don't have a spot because this person isn't leaving. That happens at a restaurant. Not everybody's engaged on a board, right? So we say there's kind of a rule of a third or 80-20, something like that. And then that volunteer that really wanted to go work with you, you don't have a spot. So they go, bring their talents to another group, or they tell everybody in the world how your governance stinks. And, why would you want to be involved with them? I thought that was a great analogy. The idea is that in this marketplace, we have to commit to getting that diversity, getting more people, expanding the associate and the emeritus program to make sure that people aren't waiting in the restaurant waiting room. So the idea of moving from problem solving to something to practice, I just love this idea. I'm watching the New York City mayor race right now, which is the best TV on TV right now.
I'm hearing a lot about this.
So they asked the candidates, are you in touch with, the real people? And so the trick question was, what does an average house in Brooklyn cost? I think Yang says $80,000. Wrong. And the other person. So it's $650,000. And not one of the candidates came close to the realities of living in Brooklyn, yet they're going to represent Brooklyn. And the other one that I love is Bill Gates went on the Ellen show. That's a great YouTube if you can find it. Bill Gates, how much is rice-a-roni? One box of rice-a-roni. $5. And everybody in the audience laughing because they know it's like 99 cents or $5 for $1. And Bill goes, I'll take $5. No, Bill, that's not how we play the game. So they asked him what pizza rolls cost, and he was just butchering the whole thing. He didn't come close to any of them. But you think, here's a billionaire that has tons of foundation work, and he's working on hunger. He's working on, healthcare, and he has advisors, but does he put them on the board? Or does he just listen and then say, I know what you want, but here's what you need. And I'm guilty of it too. The story I want to tell is, and that's why we brought up the dancing. We disclosed that Jeff dated a dancer,
ballerina,
and Hillary is a retired dancer, and I had the privilege of 2 daughters that were ballerinas for 9 years. I never want to see a nutcracker again. But we developed a not-for-profit. We put a tremendous amount of work into this, and it was tremendously successful. And about in the 4th year, I was pulling every governance card I had. It was just humming along. So we had this event, and we had dancers from Russia and China show up in Houston, Texas, and it was unbelievable. We pulled every favor possible, made a boatload of money to fund operations for a nice long time. So we had a surplus. So I went into the board and I said, look, the director has 2 kids, a wife, and, he doesn't have any health care. So let's take the surplus and make him buy health care. But he was a professional dancer. And, if he was my advisor, he would have said, we're not worried about health care. We want cash because we're mobile. We have to be able to go from point A to point B, and we sometimes have to leave town because we don't pay our rent and things like that. Cash is good. But I didn't ask him that. I said, I know what you want, but I told you what I need. And so we put a healthcare plan in for him, and guess what? Flat. So I was guilty of what I was talking about. As an advisor, if I would have listened to what was important and not put my values upon that, as dad saying, you must save for your 401k, or you must, you realize how much a broken arm costs. Good God, man, you've got to get some health insurance. Totally missed the point. Bad use of the money. Didn't help with the perceptions because I didn't listen.
I know what's best for you. That's what it kind of comes down to. And I mean, we kind of went through this on a very small basis when PEO or time off, things along that line. Yeah. They're going to use that time off inaccurate. They're going to use it for random things. And then when they're sick, they're not going to have it. And that is completely not what happened. People actually enjoyed it and actually utilized it.
So when we look at, do we have the guts to put our constituents on our boards to help us, give us that empathetic position of what it feels like to be in a position to be underbanked so we can make good decisions? Everybody thinks they want to have their best, put their best intentions forward, but you can totally miss the boat. So again, that's just a story of how it happened in my life that, I need to make amends for. But please, I'm not going another nutcracker the rest. I hope I don't have granddaughters or grand boys that dance, because please.
You've seen enough of the sugar plums.
I'll be having the headphones on in the back, listen to something else. So when we get to a question I get asked, 5 and 6 times a month is, should we do self-assessments? Do we do board? Should we evaluate each other? Should we do it as a team? And I can tell you right now, and here's some triggers. I'm not going to go through the list, but the triggers, like if you're seeing this, you got to do appraisals. Even if you're not on this, you need to do some type of self-assessment. You saw it as best practice with the fintech, slide I put up a little earlier. So we always want to evaluate ourselves. The reason that Disney is so good as a corporate culture is they measure everything. Every time they have a meeting, was it a good meeting? They measure everything. And we need to do that in the credit union space as well. Now, the challenge is, and Jeff and I have talked about this before, I'm not a big fan of 360 reviews for an executive or staff. And 360s is your boss evaluates you, your employee evaluates you, and your peer evaluates you. Everybody, in theory, getting all this information should be incredibly valuable, but we never train people how to give that advice. And you've been through that, Jeff.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that's kind of every consultant is like a 9-box. They're just ready to give a 360. Let's do 360s here.
But if we don't train people how to use it, it's going to be really tough. And so like when we do self-assessments, a lot of times we'll see people give them, underperformers and overachievers get the same score because their perceptions are the same, that I'm doing the best I can. When you do team investments and you're not honest, everybody, gets a ribbon. You really don't look at what's the challenges or the weaknesses of your group. So if you're going to do self-assessments, if you're going to do team assessments, make sure that we look at what the scale means. We're all going to have the same definitions. We understand what the words mean, all those classic things to make sure you get some value out of it. Just don't check the box that we did one and say we did one.
Yeah.
And the thing that I have the most challenge with is when if I'm on a 9-person board and I evaluate 8 of my peers, people are not equipped to do that in most situations without training. You're either going to over or under, it's the halo horns when you look at performance management for staff. We're going to overrate people. We're going to underrate people. So the challenge is there is set the standards, set the competencies you want to be high performing as a board, and then you measure people against that. And I think you can do that as a team. I think you can do that as a self-assessment. But the challenge of doing everybody, I do you, I do you, I do you, is you got to have a safe space, as cliche as that sounds, and that people are going to be listening. and that you're honest, about it. So these triggers are things that we say, absolutely, it's time to do some type of assessment tool. And then when we look at, this slide, what we're saying is oversight has morphed into any subject that your stakeholders feel that is material. And that goes back to the question, I know what you want, but here's what you need. If it's material to one of your communities that you serve, or a section of town, or a socioeconomic class, it should be important to the board. And, it's the cliche is, you go back 30 years ago, you would have board members say, well, why do people borrow for cars? They should just save up a little bit every month and then pay cash. And in that era, that was a strategy. Today, kids don't even want cars. So, the perspective of they're not saving for cars, they're saving for whatever. So the idea is that if you don't reach out and if you don't have diversity on the board, we're gonna miss these increased expectations. So as we know, the environmental, social, and governance is actually coming into the not-for-profit world. So, when you see that, the cliche is big bad, energy company polluting a river, or a mining company doing something. But, credit unions have a carbon footprint, and people need to be addressing that too, because guess what? It's going to be important to some segments of your membership. And then I think we're going to be more accountable. The idea that, if there's a misstep, the CEO is not the only one that's going to be at risk of going under more scrutiny. It's going to be the whole leadership team. So the idea is that the more information. So if you're using that advisory group, get them on the board. If you're using associates, make sure they're diverse so you're getting good opinions. If you're going to use emeritus, which I love, you're just keeping that, what keeps us special. So as we have increased expectations and we add the idea that now you're going to be compensated for it, it all goes together. And then we kind of talk about this idea of, we want systems to look at oversight. We like once a year board evaluations. We think that's a good idea. We need to identify and engage, define what the board needs to look at. So think about that old governance model where CEO was the only employee and all the other employees weren't any of the board's business. That was in the weeds. But because of succession planning, we've talked about this on past webinars, that your next CEO is going to come from those ranks. You do need to be involved in that. So is it overstepping? No. Is it engagement at the proper context? Absolutely. So keep that in mind as and the perfect on-ramp to kind of assess this is your next strategic planning session. What's mine? What's yours when it comes to the CEO? What does my membership want from me? If you don't have member research or member feedback, or, we do focus groups, we look at what a brand represents. If you don't have that data, you're making decisions in a vacuum. And in the era of increased expectations is the more data, the better. And then obviously we talked about ESG a little bit earlier about that's probably going to be something on the forefront. So when we look at this, these are some stats. 97% of execs believe they're top 10 performers. And we're not talking about kindergarten snowflakes. We're talking about, adults in the working world. Now this study's old, right? But every year it tracks this way. This is not anything that would be, well, that wasn't old. It's now a new way we're looking at it. Incompetent performers are incapable of assessing what's good or bad. So they leave with the mistake and I'm awesome. If they if they come to 1 out of 5 meetings and they think, well, because I had a good reason not to be there for 2, 3, and 4, I'm an awesome contributor when I'm there. You ask the other guys, not so hot. And there was actually a study, Lominger is something we use for leadership competencies. It's an interesting group that says, what are the magic bullets that make a good leader or an executive? And they said there's zero correlation between rating and performance. So whether you rated yourself high or low, we looked at the actual performance at the group is not there.
I love the fact that that's 0.00. That is nothing.
on a medical show, what is that? That's flatline.
That's flatline. Usually there's some kind of 0.001 or something. No, this is 0.00.
And part of that education when it comes to assessments, it's a discussion, not a negotiation. It can be, well, he gave me a 3 last time out of 5. I'm giving him a 3 this time. I'll show him. Mm-hmm. We're not negotiating scores. It's not an emotional thing. It's got to be up a context of a best practice. And when I say best practice, you have a better chance of being real or true to yourself. Again, the on-ramp for doing this, I think, is strategic planning. Carve some time out to look at how we do governance. So just to recap, self can be good when people are trained and we have a good definition of what success is. They don't interpret success on their own. It's a team definition of what it means to be high performing. At the peer level, if you want to evaluate, each director individually, it can work, but we have to have a lot of education, and we got to make sure we don't have conflict avoidance. We got to make sure that people are not having grudges, that they come to the table, with kind of an open perspective on things. And really what I think is important is the team. Whether you're 7, 9, or 15, collectively, we have to be making better decisions as we better than we would if we were doing it on our own. That's kind of the low bar. And then the higher bar is, because we have HR experience and legal experience and financial acumen on the board, collectively, we're good. And the thing I want to kind of leave you with today is, if we're going to use those advisory groups, get them actually into positions, decision-making, not just thank you for the service, here's a submarine sandwich and leave. That's important. But like I said, I made a misstep. A lot of people make missteps because they don't follow through with that next piece. So these are questions. If you were to do your own evaluation, run people through this. I'm not going to go through the list right now because of time, but these are things that we would say would make a good high-performing board. So if you want to do it individually, collectively, it's up to you. But here's some things we like to look at. So how'd we do, Jeff?
We're actually ahead of time, so fantastic. We actually do have one question that we weren't able to get to on the fly. Is there any research on the optimal number of committees for boards?
So we, on our part 2 of the board survey that's going to go out probably the end of this month.
Ooh,
committees.
That's a teaser.
So keep an eye out for that.
Trailer to release.
But we do focus on committees in that survey. So we will have data on, what the prevalence is for different committees, how boards are approaching committee structures, and that sort of thing.
Fantastic.
So, from our governance work, we every year when you're looking at your configuration, I think it's up for grabs whether they stay or they get retired. Some committees run their course, and they're not needed, and some that we regulatorily we have to have every year. So forget about those. And then the idea is like, well, if you were building a big building, you had a building committee, great. But when the building's done and the committee's still meeting, that's not the best use of their time. So that's an okay example. But the idea is every time look at it. And then also what I think high performing committees do, and I do this with exec comp committees a lot, is every year they reaffirm their charter. What's mine, what's yours? So sometimes they're supposed to do succession planning. Sometimes they got too in the weeds. So it gives you a chance to reset. And every time you have rotation on the committee, which I think is good, that you're making sure that you're reaffirming what is our charge, what are we supposed to do, and is this still what we want to do according to our fellow directors. So there's no right number, there's no wrong number, but assessing the value to the group as a whole. The number one weakness of a board is when they redo committee work. So if you go back to the last 12 board meetings, you said, the IT committee spent all this time and then we asked these questions and they had to go back to the drawing board. Well, then why aren't you on the committee? So again, what's ours, what's yours is very important. So, I hope you're reading into that. I think less committees is more effective. But again, I want specialists and expertise. So every board's going to have a different answer to that.
Yeah. And I think there's a big, to your point, there's a big difference between knowledge and experience. You have these individuals that do have the knowledge. And what you were talking about is I have the knowledge that this particular benefit was very valuable, but the experience from that individual said, no, cash is much more experience. So the same thing when it comes down to the boards, having knowledge is one thing, having the experience is completely different.
And that was the transition of if we're going to use advisory folks, make a commitment to get them actually on the board, because that's a very powerful, will make you make better decisions.
Absolutely. All right, guys, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Once again, this webinar has been recorded, so we'll be posting it on our website in about 3 to 5 days. If you missed anything, please feel free to pop on there. There's also all of the webinars from the past are listed there. You'll receive a follow-up email that will have a download link for the slide deck that we used today, and as well as that survey to let us know how we're doing. John, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it.
We have 20 seconds for the tap dancing solo.
Hit it. Hillary.
Sorry, like I said, second grade. I don't think I can recreate that anymore.
So what you guys don't know is Hillary's going to kill us after this. So if you don't hear from us in a couple of weeks, you know what happened.
Stay safe, everybody.
Stay safe. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.